All right, so we didn't get through all that, so we can finish that up. I believe, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, we are down to the arrest and trial, right? Okay, all right. So, looking there, beginning in, let's have a word of prayer. Tim, would you lead us in a word of prayer before we get started? Amen. All right, so we are in Luke 22, beginning in verse 54, and we're going to read down through 62. Having arrested him, they led him and brought him into the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. Now when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied him, saying, "Woman, I do not know him." And after a little while, another saw him and said, "You also are of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then, after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Surely this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." Immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So Peter went out and wept bitterly. All right, so as we've been going through this account, we have been noticing some of the differences between Luke's account and Matthew and Mark's accounts. You remember Matthew and Mark, they're kind of similar. There was a pretty major difference, though, in Mark's account of what we just read. Do you remember what that was? Right, he relayed a lot more emotion from Peter's denial. You remember he talked about some cursing going on there, and so it kind of showed, Peter really got upset that third time around. But there was something else in there. All right, that's what we see here in Luke, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. But in Mark's account, he recorded the rooster crowing twice. You remember that? And so, a little bit, and some people will say, "Oh, that's a contradiction," things like that, but it's not. It was normal for the rooster to crow twice, once at midnight, and then later on, right at the break of dawn, then it would crow again. And that's just the way that Mark recorded it. The others don't record it that way because generally people don't pay any attention to the one that crows at midnight. And so, they just pay attention to the one that crows at daybreak. All right, so question number 1 under this section: how does Luke, in his account, give more meaning to the words in verse 62 where it says, Peter went out and wept bitterly? Teresa, you hit on that a while ago. Yeah, there in verse 61, and the Lord turned and looked at Peter. You see how Luke brings these little subtle things out and shows them to you? Can you imagine being Peter in that moment? He just denied the Lord the third time. He heard the rooster crow, and then Jesus, suffering what he was suffering. And I say suffering because what we're getting ready to read in the next section likely was going on at the same time that Peter is denying him. And we'll talk about why that is in a moment. But probably he is going through this trial and suffering and all these things. That rooster crows at daybreak. Remember, they're doing this during the night. And then all of a sudden the Lord turns around and they make eye contact. Can you imagine how Peter melted at that moment? Now we know from other accounts, and especially John's account, Jesus did a lot to help Peter along, from that denial. And we'll talk about that more as we get into the book of John. But Peter is really humbled right at that moment, and really humbled is a soft word to use for that. He is crushed in that moment. All right, let's look at verses 63 through 71, and then we'll have some more comments on that. Now the men who held Jesus mocked him and beat him, and having blindfolded him, they struck him on the face and asked him, saying, "Prophesy, who is the one who struck you?" And many other things they blasphemously spoke against him. As soon as it was day, the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, came together and led him into their council, saying, "If you are the Christ, tell us." But he said to them, "If I tell you, you will by no means believe. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. Hereafter the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God." Then they all said, "Are you then the Son of God?" He said to them, "You rightly say that I am." And they said, "What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." All right, what did Jesus confess to the Sanhedrin? That he is the Son of God. All right, so he confessed that to the Sanhedrin. That's going to be important as we get into chapter 23 to remember that. All right, but what was the response of those who were questioning him? Yeah, got you. We got you now. Okay, we got you on what? Think about it. What could they do with that? They couldn't do anything with that. All right, and so we'll see why that's important to understand that here in just a moment. What I want you to notice is, we saw the denial of Peter, and then we see this where they're having this mock trial. They're mocking him and beating him and having this mock trial. All of that's going on during the night. Matthew and Mark's accounts record this a little bit differently. They record Peter's denial after all this mock trial. Okay? And so what that shows to us then by comparing these is those are not sequential events. Those are probably happening at the same time. And so whenever you think about, Jesus is arrested in the middle of the night. They bring him, in verse 54, they brought him to the high priest's house, and Peter is following at a distance. And then we have the record of his denial, but during the record of his denial, then we have all these other events going on, with Christ, with Jesus. And so all of those things are happening at the same time. They're beating him, they're mocking him, making fun of him, shaming him, doing whatever they can to him to degrade Jesus. And at the same time, Peter's over here in the corner looking at a distance and saying, "Oh, I don't know him. I don't know what you're talking about," Denying Jesus. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. That is right. All right, so what did Jesus Okay, we talked about that. What, there was something else I was going to mention. Okay, well, that's fine. But it'll come up in a minute, I'm sure. All right, look at chapter 23, verses 1 through 5. Then the whole multitude of them arose and led him to Pilate, and they began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Then Pilate asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him and said, "It is as you say." So Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no fault in this man." But they were the more fierce, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place." All right, what was missing from the accusations against Jesus? Okay, witnesses. His confession of what? To be Son of God. They didn't mention anything about him being Son of God. Did you see that? Yeah. Whenever we see his confession over in verses 66 through 71 of 22, there's no mention of him being a king, you see. But whenever they bring him to Pilate, that's what they bring up. They bring up this accusation of him being king. And there are some other ones too. Matter of fact, what did they accuse him of? All right, stirring up the crowds. What's that? Forbidding to pay taxes. He's a king. We see that. Perverting the nation. What does that even mean? Perverting the nation. Might cause an uprising. All right, yeah. What did Jesus come to the earth to do? Seek and save the lost. What had to happen during that process? Were there not a lot of changes that had to come? Those who live in, they've gotten used to a certain lifestyle. Whenever they suddenly see this change happening, how are they going to perceive that? They're going to perceive that as perverting the nation. It's a lot different. He's teaching differently than what the scribes and Pharisees do. And so we see that difference in his teaching. Did he forbid people to pay taxes? No, that was an absolute lie. Now, we talked about, the absence of witnesses. There, other accounts mention false witnesses coming forward and saying these things, and so probably that's what's happening here. But no, none of these accusations are true, really, except for which one? That he's the king. That's right. And Pilate even asked him, "Are you a king then?" And he said, "Yeah." I mean, it's just you say it is. But evidently, that wasn't a big deal to Pilate. What did Pilate say about him? I don't find no fault in this man. Find no fault in this man. Regardless, Pilate sees all of these accusations as baseless accusations. Any thoughts before we continue? Yes. Yeah, it could be he's being swayed by his wife's dream. Yeah, and we studied that a little bit. We don't really know exactly where that happened within this trial, but yes, very possibly could be that. All right, let's look at verses 6 through 12. When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at the time. Now when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceedingly glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he hoped to see some miracle done by him. Then he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Then Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. That very day, Pilate and Herod became friends with each other, for previously they had been at enmity with each other. All right, what was Jesus, or why was Jesus sent to Herod? Because he's a Galilean. Herod has jurisdiction over the area of Galilee, and he happened to be in Jerusalem at the time, and so as far as Pilate's concerned, that's just too easy. I'm going to send you over to Herod. You're his problem. I don't really have to be the one dealing with this. We think about. I lost it. Whenever you have a thought, yes, whatever. Another reason that may not be mentioned is that Pilate thought he could pass off this problem to someone else. And so, remember that that's playing a part in all of this. This would have been a good case to judge, or not been a good case to judge by Pilate, and he didn't want to have anything to do with that. What was Herod's reaction to Jesus being sent? He was glad. Yeah, at first. Then what was his reaction? Because what happened? Send him over here. I want to see what he can do. What did Jesus do? Nothing. He didn't even say anything. Did you notice what Luke shows us about all of these proceedings that maybe we didn't see in any of the other accounts? Look at verse 11. Then Herod with his men of war treated him with contempt and mocked him, arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. Oftentimes we talk about the suffering of Jesus. And we talk about him hanging on the cross. And at times we'll even talk about, him being beat and scourged before that. Do we ever think about how many times he was beaten and mocked and shamed and treated this way? 3 times at least is the way Luke is showing us. At the most, you can get 2 out of the other accounts. But because of this interaction with Herod, we learned that at least 3 times he was treated this way by soldiers. He went through a whole lot of suffering before he ever went to Calvary. And we don't need to be forgetting that. We think about the disappointment that Herod had over this, allowing the soldiers to do all of this and then just send him back to Pilate. I can't do nothing with this. What good is this? So he sends him back. Look at verses 13 through 25. Then Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests and the rulers of the people, said to them, "You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. No, neither did Herod, for I sent you back to him. I sent you back to him. And indeed, nothing deserving of death has been done by him." Now, I want you to notice what he says there. Pilate and Herod are not saying necessarily that he is absolutely innocent. I want you to understand. Yes, we see that phrase, I find no fault in him. But what fault are they looking for? One that would allow them to put him to death. Okay? And so they're not finding anything with Jesus that would mean that they need to put him to death. And I want you to understand that that's really what's coming out of this. when we think about Pilate and we think about, how many times he says, I find no fault in him, he doesn't care whether he's innocent or guilty. Pilate doesn't care anything at all about that. All he cares about is keeping the peace. And he just needs a reason to take care of this. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. Pilate may have taken some pleasure in all of this. Herod taking pleasure in all these proceedings. And yeah, why did Herod and Pilate become friends after that? It could be because they had a like mind toward Jesus. And it's not a good mind, you see. All right, well, continue on. Verse 16. I will therefore chastise him and release him, for it was necessary for him to release one to them at the feast. And they all cried out at once, saying, Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas, who had been thrown into the prison for a certain rebellion made in the city, and for murder. Pilate therefore, wishing to release Jesus, again called out to them. But they shouted, saying, Crucify him, crucify him. Then he said to them the third time, Why? What evil has he done? I have found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. But they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. So Pilate gave sentence that it should be as they requested, and he released to them the one they requested, who for rebellion and murder had been thrown into prison, but he delivered Jesus at their will. All right, why did Pilate release Jesus? Or why, I'm sorry, let me reread that, because it's different on your paper than what I said, ain't it? Yeah, see, listen, that three-letter word's important. Why did Pilate not release Jesus? What? To please the crowd. The crowd wouldn't let him release him. What was Pilate going to do? Huh? Yeah, he's going to chastise him, beat him, flog him, all of those things. He's going to punish him. Pilate wasn't just going to say, all right, you go on. He wasn't going to do that. But they want him dead. They want him dead. And so he didn't release him because of the people. As I said a while ago, he's the one in charge of keeping the peace. And that's what he has to do. And if he has to put somebody to death to keep the peace, then ultimately that's what he's going to do. Pilate could not release Jesus, or he would have risked an uprising among the people. All right, how does Luke show the prejudice of the Jews? All right, he records they're consistently refusing to let Pilate let him go, chastise him and let him go. We see that. It's over and over again. But the other accounts are doing that. The other accounts do that. There's something. What's that? Jews are going to let a murderer loose. Now, I think his Mark's account gave a little more information about Barabbas, but I want you to notice that Luke mentioned it twice. Luke brought up the fact that he was, caught in rebellion and murder twice. And Luke is bringing that out and pointing that out. Jesus, here he is, Jesus, whom, no fault was found in him, but then you got this criminal here that's absolutely deserving of death. And the Jews want him released instead of Jesus. And so Luke is kind of helping us to see some of those things. All right, any thoughts or questions on that section before we continue? Oh, and I forgot my outline. See? Right there it is. All right, so We have gone through the Last Supper, the betrayal, the arrest and trial. We are now going here into the crucifixion, beginning in verse 26. It is now as they led him away, they laid hold of a certain man, Simon, a Cyrenian, who was coming from the country, and on him they laid the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. And a great multitude of the people followed him, and women who also mourned and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, Blessed are the barren, wombs that never bore, and breasts which never nursed. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and the hills cover us. For if they do these things in the greenwood, what will be done in the dry? All right, first of all, what prompted Jesus' comments? Yeah, the women who were following behind and mourning and crying or lamenting, and that's what we need to understand from that in verse 27. This was, they wasn't crying to themselves. I mean, they were weeping and wailing. It was a loud commotion that they were doing as they were going along. And so these are women who knew who Jesus is and are weeping and crying out aloud because they don't want him to see him crucified either. It does not tell us specifically who these women are. Later on we have some specifics, and I believe John actually mentions several, but we'll talk about that at a later time. All right, what did he mean by these words that he told them? What's he talking about? Could be the fall of Jerusalem that he's talking about. Basically he's saying the worst is yet to come, and it's going to happen to them. He's not saying that it will happen to them personally, but it's going to happen to the Jews. It's going to be a national thing there in Jerusalem. He's giving this prophecy probably about the destruction of Jerusalem that is going to come in 70 A.D. And all of the turmoil that's going to happen because of that. This is similar to what he talked about before. The proverb in verse 31, notice what he says, For if they do these things in the greenwood, what will be done in the dry? Any ideas what that's talking about? That's exactly what's going on here. If you treat the innocent this way, think about how much worse it's going to be on the guilty. That's generally what the proverb means. And here it's talking about Jesus. Jesus is innocent, and they are unlawfully crucifying him. All right, he didn't do anything to merit this. But the Jews, on the other hand, Jerusalem, has done all of this against him. They are absolutely guilty, and they are going to suffer because of that. And the problem is those who are innocent are going to suffer right along with them. There's going to be a lot of that going on, and so Now, here's something else to think about. It might not be talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, it may just be a general warning for persecution in the future. That very well could be too. But with that verse 31, that seems to be what it's leaning toward, the idea that the guilty are going to be punished, and it's going to be much more severe than what Jesus is going to be enduring at this time. And so that tends to lean toward the destruction of Jerusalem. Any thoughts on that? It is a proverb. It's not necessarily in Proverbs. Yeah, I couldn't find anything that really matched that. There's some in my Bible. There are some cross references to some things in Proverbs and Ezekiel and such, but none of them really match exactly with that. It's just kind of that idea, that matches that. Okay, Verses 32 through 43. There were also two other criminals led with him to be put to death. And when they had come to the place called Calvary, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right hand, the other on the left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. And they divided his garments and cast lots. And the people stood looking on, but even the rulers with them sneered, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ, the chosen of God. And the soldiers also mocked him, coming and offering him sour wine, and saying, If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. And an inscription also was written over him in the letters of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, This is the King of the Jews. Then one of the criminals who were hanged blasphemed him, saying, If you are the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. We could probably spend a couple of weeks on this one, but we're not going to. Well, unless y'all want to, I don't care. What trait of Jesus does Luke bring out in his record of these events? Forgiveness. Yeah, absolutely. Jesus' forgiveness. You know, Luke is the only one to record the comment in verse 34. And there is some, disagreement as to whether that verse should actually be there. There are some transcripts that do not include that. Most of the modern versions, they're going to put that in brackets or footnoted in some way that it is not considered to have been in the original text. Well, anytime that I see something like that, I'm going to go do a little bit of research on that because I want to know, okay, where did this come from? You know, some of these are easy to see. Some of them, you know, it was said in a different account, and so you can see how the copyist, as he's copying through the New Testament, you know, he would remember that and just accidentally put it in there as he's going along, okay? We don't have this recorded anywhere else. We don't have anything like it recorded anywhere else. And from the evidence that I have looked at as far as the manuscripts and all of that, they give it an A rating that it is not there, which means that they are fairly confident that verse is not in the original text. However, I went and looked at the notes, and I can't see how they would have given that an A rating. All they're basing that on is they have one or two old manuscripts that are older than many of the others that do not include it. But even in those manuscripts, there are, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Like, well, I can't even remember the name of it. But one of the oldest ones that they look at, it did include it. But there was a later footnote that was added that said it shouldn't be there. Yeah. And that makes me pause and think, okay, y'all really don't have a reason for not including this in the text. And probably that's the reason why every modern version that I could come across had it in the text. They're not going to take it out of the Bible because there's no good reason for them to take it out of the Bible. I would imagine that probably this belongs there. This was in the original text because there's no other reason for it to be there. Why would Luke insert that there? You know, there's no context to give us that unless it was actually said. And so that is my opinion. I am not a scholar in those things, but from what I have looked at what the scholars have said, I cannot say along with them that shouldn't be there. It looks as though it ought to be in there. Yes, okay, and there's a good point. You know, whenever Stephen is being stoned over in Acts chapter 7, I believe that's in Acts chapter 7, you know, he says a similar thing. Yeah, he looks up and sees the Lord and says, don't lay this to their charge or something like that. And so it's a very similar statement. You know, that's the only other time we see anything like that in Scripture. And you think about the copyists and, you know, would they have brought that from Stephen's statement? I just can't see how they could have done that in this context. What's that? Yes, and Jesus taught that over and over. When you're praying, you know, forgiveness needs to be part of your prayer. It needs to be part of that. We need to be forgiving others. And so Jesus demonstrates this. He demonstrates this in verse 34 and, you know, saying, forgive them for they don't know what they're doing. How else does Jesus demonstrate his forgiveness? The thief on the cross. Absolutely. Luke is the only one that records this conversation that's happening. Now, how does this reconcile with the other accounts? Because, you know, Matthew and Mark, I believe both of those say that both thieves ridicule Jesus. Here we've only got one ridiculing Jesus and the other, you know, standing up for him, so to speak. Yeah, more than likely that's what's happened. Early on, they're both caught up in the ridicule of the soldiers and everybody that's around him, and they begin to ridicule him, you know, right along with them. And then this thief realizes somewhere along the lines, wait a minute, what am I doing? You know, now, what did this man know about Jesus? What? I find it difficult that he would have known nothing about him. What? He had a kingdom. So, you know, the idea that, look at verse 42. Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. That's right. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. You know, so there's some hints in there that helps us to understand this man had come into contact with Jesus or had heard about Jesus or is hearing about the teaching or something. He knows something about Jesus, all right? And from what he understands, and probably from some of the signs that he has seen happen, he is realizing he is who he says he is. They're hanging on the cross, dying. And he says, remember me when you come into your kingdom. This man, this thief, realizes that this is not the end for Jesus. So he's heard enough to understand, at least at this point, who Jesus is and what he's about to do. And it just interests me that he knows as much as he does. Now, I'll do this quickly. What does this teach us about baptism? Answer it quickly. You know the answer. So what does it teach us about baptism? Nothing. Thank you. It teaches us nothing about baptism. Nothing whatsoever. And anybody that brings that up and says, see, the thief on the cross was saved without being baptized, it has nothing whatsoever to do with that. This happened before the church was established. And I would also contend to you that we don't know that he wasn't baptized. He knows about Jesus. Anyhow, that's a different discussion for another day. All right. Let's continue on. Verses 44 through 49. Now it was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. Then the sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. So when the centurion saw what had happened, he glorified God, saying, Certainly this was a righteous man. And the whole crowd who came together to that sight, seeing what had been done, beat their breasts and returned. But all his acquaintances and the women who followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things. All right. Number 3. How did Jesus die? He gave himself up. He gave himself up. He breathed his last. He gave his spirit up. And that's essentially what we need to understand from this and from the other accounts. Matthew said that he yielded up his spirit. He released it. John recorded that he gave up or handed over his spirit. These all fall in line with the statement in Luke that Luke recorded in Psalm 31. Verse 5, I believe it is, where he says, into your hands I commit my spirit. That word commit there, it means to hand over. It means to, here, it's yours now. You're putting it into someone's care. And I'm going to talk more about that in our sermon this morning. But notice the words of Jesus in John's record in chapter 10, verses 17 and 18. He says, therefore my Father loves me because I lay down my life that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father. And so what we absolutely need to understand from that is Jesus wasn't killed by the Jews or the Romans. He was crucified by them, but he gave up his own spirit. He gave up his own life on the cross. What reactions did this bring? All right, we see a lot of people understanding at that time. What did the centurion say? What did it say there? He's a righteous man, okay? Some versions may say an innocent man, okay? And so what did the other accounts say? The centurion said, truly this is the Son of God. Luke doesn't record it that way. And I find that interesting, and I don't have a good reason for that. Maybe he said this and then later on said this is the Son of God, different things. Could be different things. Yes. Yes. Constantly talking to the Father. Jesus is completely dependent upon the Father at this time. And we need, anyhow, let me wait till the worship hour before I get into that. Because we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But it wasn't just the centurion. Look at the crowd. What their response was. And the response is upon verse 46, where having said this, he breathed his last. And that's what Luke is pointing out. He gave up the ghost. He breathed his last. And so that's what has brought this reaction on. It's interesting that he records it that way because Matthew and Mark, they do it differently. Matthew points out that the centurion, seeing the earthquakes and things that happened, then he responded, this is the Son of God. All right? Mark points to seeing him cry out and breathe his last, sort of like Luke does. And so it's probably a combination of these. It's not a contradiction. Likely he is saying this, as Jesus is breathing his last. And then probably, witnessing the earthquakes and those things, then he says, you know what, this was the Son of God, And so understand that. We've got the crowd. The crowd there is evidently, they have changed their mind in some way. They are beating their breast, and that is a sign of grief and sorrow, kind of over what has happened here. It doesn't say whether that crowd that is mentioned there was was against Jesus or for Jesus before that. But we do kind of see that. And then the acquaintances. It says, now, the word that's translated acquaintances is literally the known ones. Okay? And so the reason why I point that out is because these are those that are known by Jesus. It is not saying these are the ones who know Jesus. Does that make sense? I know that's just a little thing, but but to me that makes a difference, because these are the ones that Jesus is acquainted with, that He knows, that He has been in the company of. It is not necessarily those people who claim that they know Jesus. It's not from that direction. All right, and maybe there's not that big of a deal between that. Maybe the way they use that word, it would go either way. Yes, and you'll see that. The modern versions will say those who knew Him. And that's the reason why I went back and looked. Okay, what is that word talking about? And it seems to be more along the lines of Him knowing them rather than them knowing Him. Yes, Jesus' friends. And we could absolutely just say that. Jesus' friends, yeah. Those who have been traveling with Him. And as a matter of fact, it even says, and the women who followed Him from Galilee. It talks about them. But what are they doing? What are the acquaintances and those who followed Him from Galilee? What are they doing? Yeah, they're off at a distance, watching all of these things. Okay? Who is not off at a distance? Do you know? Yeah, John and his mother Mary, for sure. But John also records that Jesus' aunt, his mother's sister, is there. And also there are two other Marys that are there too. And so there's a few women that are right there at the cross, because Jesus, points to John and says, behold your mother, behold your son, that interaction. All right, so anyhow, likely His disciples and followers mostly are watching from a distance. They don't want to get caught up in all of these things that are happening. And so they're watching off at a distance. All right. I have gone beyond. Yes? Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. She's talking about the suffering on the cross, how it was difficult for them to breathe, and so the point that He was able to get a breath at that point, He was not weakened to the point where He could not get a breath and cry out. He did not die as a result of the crucifixion. He died because it was time, and He had done what He'd done. Another account says, He says, it is finished. And he yielded up His spirit. So, yes, a lot of things going on there. There's a couple of books from what is it? Truth for Today commentaries. That series. There is a couple of books on the life of Christ. Back whenever I first started coming here, we did the gospel, the Harmony of the Gospels. We went through that. Well, those two books, Life of Christ, is a harmony of the Gospels. And if you ever get a hold of those are good to go through too. There's a lot more information in there. And I've started kind of looking at that to see how some of these things line up from time to time. Appreciate y'all's comments and questions, and I guess we'll finish up that sheet next week and get into the next